In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives, so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking the hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness!" for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was so close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I've spoken with God, and he abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Follow-up study 2000. Dr. G.F. Department of Neurology. Hospital name withheld. San Francisco, California. Recent study of a degenerative disease which targets the motor function and cognitive decline often leads to hallucinations of the deceased. The death of targeted cells and chemicals in the brain by this disease leads to a loss of smell, among other senses. The cause of the disease is unknown. Hallucinations present in 39.8% of the patients, falling into 3 categories: a sensation of a presence, person, a sideways passage, commonly of an animal, or illusions, present in 25.5% of patients, an isolated occurrence in 14.3%, formed visual hallucinations present in 22.2%, isolated in 9.3%, and auditory hallucinations present in 9.7%, isolated in 2.3%. Continuing study in San Francisco, California, 2003 present. When thinking back to my earliest memories, nothing is concrete. A string of hazy images come to mind like random snapshots at a time, each one associated with certain feelings and emotions. They are imbued with a mystical, dreamlike quality, a gift born of childhood naivety. The magic of every Christmas when Santa was still real, for example, is an experience of pure joy that is lost with maturity. Many of these snapshots are impossible to place in any sort of context. They're just there, sunken in the crevices of the brain without rhyme or reason, playing with my dad's beard in the wood-paneled room, him smiling down at me, comforting, or discovering a long row of marching ants in someone's wooded backyard, all by myself. Exciting. Some of them don't even seem real in hindsight. Did I actually fall from that tree by the lake, only to land on my feet without a scratch? Was it really a dream? I don't think so. Sure, I have memories of distant dreams, but there's a clear distinction between the dreams and reality of my past. I don't know how I can tell. I just can't. And for this reason, one memory has always troubled me. The experience was so surreal, and yet certain details stand out with marked clarity. I'm not exactly sure when it happened. I couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. My brother and I were sleeping on our bunk bed. Because he was older, he got the top bunk. I had just woken up, but it was still nighttime. Something felt different. I remember seeing and smelling the rain, but not hearing any. The window was open and it was very cold in the room. Why was the window open? The curtains were gently flapping, but there was no breeze. The quiet was so intense, it buzzed through my ears. I had been lying on my side, with one arm dangling off the edge of the bed. Gradually I became aware that it was warmer near the floor. I felt some kind of heated breeze gently strike my hand, coming and going in short bursts. Finally, I recognized it as someone's breathing. Then the woman slid out from under the bed. The nightlight showed that she had long blondish hair and wore a white nightgown. And in the dimness, I thought it was my mother. I wasn't at all scared. It's funny how a child's mind works. What's Mommy doing under the bed? Must be getting something, or checking for monsters. I was too tired to say anything, and remained motionless, watching. The woman was on her back, but her face stayed in the shadows. She rolled over and crawled on all fours to the far end of the bed, then glided up the ladder to the top bunk. Her every movement was silky smooth and completely silent. She reminded me of a white ribbon dancing in the wind. I closed my eyes and fell back to sleep. I also remember my brother telling me about a weird dream the next morning. He dreamt of a woman who lived under the floor and came out at night to play in the rain. When her clothes got soaked, she went back inside and whispered things to anyone who was sleeping. It became a recurring dream for him until our family moved out of that house. Strange what the brain chooses to remember.